Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're basically putting on our lab coats and doing a historical autopsy. We are looking at the lifespan of human empires. If you've ever wondered why these massive, great societies rise, peak, and then ultimately just fall apart, well, you're absolutely in the right place. We're going to dissect the historical, the ecological, and the psychological patterns that really dictate the fate of every major civilization. Okay, let's dive into this. 88. According to a pretty fascinating BBC analysis by researcher Luke Kemp, 88 ancient civilizations collapsed just between the years 3000 BCE and 1000 CE. Think about that. That is an incredibly high turnover rate for what we usually like to think of as permanent societies. And, if you zoom out even further, that number easily tops 100. And that actually brings us to this incredible historical mic drop from the famous 20th century historian Arnold Toynbee. He observed that great civilizations are not murdered, they take their own lives. This right here, this is a foundational concept for our explainer today. Civilizational collapse isn't some weird bug in the human operating system. It's an inevitable, mathematically predictable feature of human-centered agricultural societies. They don't fall just because of bad luck, they follow a very strict internal life cycle.
Which leads us to part 1, the pattern of collapse, a natural, predictable process.
So to really get this, we have to start treating civilizations like living organisms, right? Just like anything that lives and breathes, they consume, they grow, and eventually they exhaust themselves. The ecologist John Michael Greer actually coined a perfect term for this: catabolic collapse. In biology, catabolism is basically the process where a living thing feeds on itself. So when a complex society outgrows its ecological carrying capacity, it gets forced into this gnarly death spiral. To maintain all its massive infrastructure, the empire literally has to consume its own capital, essentially cannibalizing itself all the way back down to scattered ruins. To really wrap our heads around why this happens, we kind of need to look at our timeline. For 95% of our history, which is roughly 20,000 generations, human beings lived in these localized, totally sustainable communities, tightly bound by natural ecological limits. But the last 5%, just roughly 400 generations, saw this explosive shift to totalitarian agriculture and massive city-based expansion. And that fundamentally altered our relationship with reality. We started treating the living world not as a community that we belong to, but just as a resource to be exploited. Moving into part 2, the culture of empire, the inherent need for expansion. So what exactly went down when we left that localized, sustainable timeline? The author and activist Max Wilbert uses this brilliant term, culture of empire. He uses this to define a civilization that is inherently built on continuous expansion, constant warfare, and the severe loss of any intimate connection with the land. This type of society operates entirely on a colonial mentality. It literally refuses to accept the physical limits of its local ecology, and instead it just forcefully takes resources from its neighbors and the earth itself. And as you can probably guess, this creates a vicious positive feedback loop. Step 1. You conquer new land to get virgin resources. Step 2, that influx of cheap energy allows your population and your complexity to just explode, completely overshooting natural limits. And step 3, the empire begins to implode under the compounding debt of its own maintenance. Pursuing this immoderate greatness basically forces the empire to consume absolutely everything, leaving behind nothing but denuded landscapes and exhausted soils. Now for part 3, industrial Stockholm Syndrome, the captive mind. This leads us to a rather uncomfortable question. If we know this loop is ultimately destructive, why in the world do we fiercely defend the very system that's driving us toward collapse? Well, Max Wilbert suggests we're actually suffering from a macro-level version of Stockholm Syndrome. In a traditional hostage situation, right, captives defend their captors because their immediate survival depends on them. On an industrial scale, our minds completely avoid the terrifying cognitive dissonance of our situation by just siding with the economy of occupation. Let's be real, we are utterly tethered to the grocery store, the electric grid, industrial medicine, and the global economy. As an impartial observer of history, you kind of have to admit, we are completely dependent on these conveniences. Because our daily survival actually requires them, we become desperately motivated to maintain the status quo, even as it actively depletes the exact ecological capital our own descendants are going to need. Let's look at part 4, the Age of Decadence, the terminal symptoms of empire. To perform the final stage of our empire autopsy, we're going to use the historical framework of Sir John Glubb, 250. Glubb studied empires throughout history and found this remarkably consistent, mathematically predictable, natural lifespan. Barring some crazy outside invasion, a civilization lasts about 250 years, or roughly 10 generations, before it naturally rots from the inside out. Glubb actually traced this arc across 5 distinct stages. It always starts with the courageous age of pioneers pushing outward. This builds the age of commerce, which generates immense wealth, ushering in the age of affluence. With so much extra wealth, society then funds the age of intellect, marked by endless philosophical debate. But actually, that unceasing cacophony of argument paralyzes action, leading directly into the final stage, the Age of Decadence.
According to the historical sources, this terminal phase is incredibly recognizable. It features extreme wealth disparity, a transition away from civic duty and toward demanding entitlements, and widespread political corruption. Historically speaking, and just neutrally observing the data here, this is the exact point where a fatal opposition takes root between the haves and the have-nots, which ends up tearing the social fabric apart.
But perhaps the most jarring symptom Glubb identified is perfectly captured right here. In the Age of Decadence, the populace worships celebrities. We're talking actors, athletes, musicians, instead of divinities or heroes of character. The culture just becomes totally obsessed with entertainment, frivolity, and materialism, actively ignoring the literal ecological enemy at the gate. Finally, Part 5, The Long Descent, Navigating the Inevitable. So where does that actually leave us? Well, I want to reassure you. Understanding this mathematical decline is definitely not a reason to panic. Actually, it provides crystal clarity for what comes next. As John Michael Greer points out, we need to correct our mental imagery here. Collapse is almost never falling off a cliff. It's not some sudden overnight Hollywood apocalypse. Instead, it is tumbling down a slope. It's a long descent. It's a gradual stair-step slide right into history's dumpster, marked by periods of acute crisis, followed by partial recoveries and, new normals. So, the absolutely crucial point here is this. Once we accept this post-doom reality, we can actually shift our energy away from anxiety and toward clear-eyed action. We must shed the exhausting illusion of eternal progress. We have to recognize our complete dependence on nature. We've got to move past denial and start focusing on localized, resilient, compassionate living right in our own communities. I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought. We've seen the data. We've seen the 250-year life cycle. We know the loop. Knowing that civilizational collapse is literally as natural as the changing of the seasons, how will you choose to live during the descent? Think about your sphere of influence and what kind of resilience you can build today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time. We have built our world on a high-stakes assumption that our industrial momentum is as unsinkable as the steel hulls we once set into the Atlantic. But the elephant in the room has grown too large to ignore, moving out of our private shadows and into the center of our lives. This is the meta-crisis, the tipping point where the stories of endless growth collide with the physical limits of our planet. The Lifeboat mini-course is your immediate, structured transition, a free 5-day journey delivered to your inbox to transform global anxiety into local resilience. Day 1 begins with an audit of the invisible, the energy and water systems you rely on every hour, yet rarely ever see. Day 2 forces a change in your geographical lens, challenging you to locate your true home within your watershed and local bioregion. You won't navigate this terrain alone. You will receive daily study guides and synthesized patterns designed to cut through the noise and reveal the architecture of change. Day 3 asks you to practice active hope in a world facing ecological overshoot. Day 4 introduces the demanding standard of revolutionary love. By tracing the water back to your neighbor's tap, you move beyond the narrow walls of self-help and into the expansive, interconnected practice of systems health. The climax arrives on Day 5 with the introduction of a specific framework for your future, the 9x21 harvest. Who is your mutual guiding spirit in this transition, and which 9 things will you choose to do? Stop waiting for the headlines to crush you. Sign up for the Lifeboat mini-course now. Access your Day 1 materials immediately and join the community hub where the next story of our world is already being written.
You can remain tied to the illusion of a collapsing global credit card, or take this course to begin building real systems health today. The Earth is tired of the lie. It is time to dance with the truth.